I first encountered Poe in a Southern literature class in college.
Yeah.
And so it's interesting to hear about kind of American identity and finding that voice. But how did Poe identify as a distinctly Southern writer? And what does that mean, I guess, to be a Southern writer?
Well, you have hit either a sweet spot or a sore spot. I don't know what to tell you. I've written a lot about this and about Poe's Southernism, as it were. The short version of this is Poe was really canny, and depending on who was paying the bills, who he was working for, he would claim to be very Southern or very American. And it really was, it's difficult to discern from his writing and certainly from his editorial work where he stood on this. It is the case, and I think I said this last time, he sort of presented himself as a pro-slavery Southerner at a lot of really key moments. As in the lead up to the Civil War, he dies in 1849, but as things get more fraught, he tends to kind of bury some of that stuff. He's from Boston, but he grows up in and around Virginia and Baltimore. So even his sort of geographical status is a little vexed. It is the case that lots of Southern literature, and this is one of my main areas of research and teaching, lots of Southern literature claims Poe. But what's so interesting about Poe is for all of his either claims to a Southern identity or claims to American identity, so much of his work actually takes place outside of both places, both the South and even the United States. A ton of this fiction, including all the detective stuff, takes place in France and in England and in Germany and in these far-flung, in Italy, as we'll see. So the fact that he has this kind of vexed relationship to both his Southernness and to American literary nationalism, I think invites us to think about him as a little more cosmopolitan and, again, a little more canny about affiliation. When he was the editor for the most important literary journal in the South, the Southern Literary Messenger, he was all in on Southern literature and Southern literary nationalism as maybe a distinct part of American literary nationalism. The idea that if we had a really good developed regional Southern literature, that would make American literature better. When he's trying to get employed in places like Boston, some of that gets kind of pushed down and it's more about a broader American literary nationalism. Suffice it to say, lots of people want to claim Poe, including Southern literary studies and many Southern writers. But it continues to be a real debate about how best to treat him, how best to, as a book recently called it, place Poe, put Poe in place. Dr. Looper?
I have a question. I loved that presentation. Could you say more about the effect on the reader that Poe imagined? Because it's I find it interesting, and I've always found it interesting, that it seems to be both physical,
yeah,
like bodily, like the rhymes and the experience of hearing the sounds of the poetry or the prose, but it's also spiritual. And so just what did Poe imagine the effect of these texts to be on the reader?
Oh, I love that. Okay, so I think your emphasis on the embodiment of the poem, of the short story, is just essential.
Yeah, like the reader can't stick around for more than a few minutes because they get tired. Their attention wanders.
I mean, so when we think about it, we often think of that in really abstract terms, right? Like, oh, I really sunk into my heart, or I really felt for that character. Poe's actually being very literal here, and I think you've nailed it, Eric. That he's being really exact about the experience, what we call the phenomenology of reading. Like, where are you going to be sitting? Can you not have to go take a bathroom break? I mean, he's really thinking about the body's experience of reading as the first step. And then the second step kind of comes from that. Can you hear these bells in your head with the poems? Or can you hear the sort of, as we'll see in a couple minutes, the staccato rhythm of the opening of the Telltale Heart? He wants you at the end of that story to feel your own heart beating, maybe at an accelerated rate. But you're absolutely right that it is connected in some fundamental way to Poe wanting, he's so bossy that he wants to manage your experience. Imagine the author like showing up at your house and saying, okay, I'm going to turn off the lights. I'm going to put your dog out. I'm going to make sure that everything is just perfect.
I bought you a chair.
What's that? Yeah, exactly. It's got to be the right kind of chair. You know, I'm going to turn down the heat. There's going to be some rustling of dead leaves or something. He is, if he could do that, Poe would have loved it. Again, because he starts out with this idea of a unity of effect, a totality of impressions that he wants every reader to experience. And I think you're absolutely right. That comes through the body and comes through the manipulation of sound, of sense, of rhythm, of many of these really higher end literary effects, with the hopes that a reader will say, okay, yeah, I'm feeling that. I've never been to Italy. I've certainly never been drunk and in a motley costume and walled up in the catacombs, but I know what that must feel like, or I want to know what that must feel like. And so I think you're absolutely right. You start with the body, you start with the experience of reading, and try desperately to have, as he says, the totality of emotions and impressions that would come along with that. And so it is a hyper, again, his word, controlled experience of literature. So James had a great question in the chat. Could it be that Poe's link to the Southern lit is to Southern Gothic and its focus on the grotesque? I think that's absolutely one genealogy, one way to connect all of this, and that's really incisive, really helpful. Yes, whether or not Poe is from the South, whether or not Southern literature claims him, his influence on that very robust body of literature of the Southern Gothic. You think of the end of A Rose for Emily. That is just like directly out of Poe. It's not cribbed or lifted, but it just feels like something Poe would write, with Miss Emily Grierson, probably having killed Homer Barron's face melting into the decades old sheet. Like that's just a very Poean image. In a lot of Flannery O'Connor, much of this feels connected. My favorite, Catherine Ann Porter, actually jokes in one of her stories about Poe being or not being a Southern writer. So I think James, absolutely, it's a great connection to the Southern Gothic. In a way that we can, in fact, initially when Eric, Elizabeth, and I had talked about this, we had thought about maybe doing a whole thing on Poe and the Southern Gothic as a bridge between them. But I think that's absolutely a great way to connect between the two. Let's see. Drake, Michelle asked, you said Poe only wrote one book, one novel. Can you expand on how that book was received by the public? It's interesting how, given how big Poe was on short stories. So yeah, it's a great question. And it is the novel is I think the technical, very fancy literary critical term for this is hot mess. It is a sea story, the narrative of Arthur Gordon Pym. It is something that he started to serialize. He actually put initially in the Southern Literary Messenger in 1836 and 37. It comes out as a standalone novel. It is wonderfully provocative and not a great novel. And Poe himself acknowledged that fact. But it has some really fascinating and unexpected, I won't give no spoiler alerts here, but I won't give anything away, but it has some unexpected turns and a really interesting set of racial representations. Pym, as we call it, is massively influential in African-American literature. And Toni Morrison especially championed it as a essential literary text. It has had such an influence in African-American literature, and now in American literature more broadly, that there's a fabulous sort of sequel satire written by a young African-American novelist called Matt Johnson that I teach all the time. It's called Pym, P-Y-M. The full title of the Poe novel is The Narrative of Arthur Gordon Pym, Nantucket. So Matt Johnson in 2014 writes this kind of amazing sequel to Pym, to Poe's Pym that really, again, I don't want to give away any spoilers here. I can't recommend it highly enough. And for those of you that have read Arthur Gordon Pym, don't miss Matt Johnson's sort of expansion of it. That's also riffing on Toni Morrison and James Kincaid the art, the master of light. There's a lot of funny jokes about hip hop culture, and it's just it's a wonderful, wonderful satire. One of the funniest books I've ever read. Again, Matt Johnson, Pym, and it's a riff on that. I think a lot of Poe's resistance to the novel form is exactly what he described, in the control that Eric and I were just talking about, the experience of reading. But another part was that novels take a long time to write and edit and get published. They don't always pay as well as an individual magazine publication. This is something that Faulkner himself experienced, often having to write short fiction in order to pay his way to a novel payday, get through by publishing short fiction. Poe is also in that mode. But as he often does, he takes a material fact and turns it into, makes a virtue out of necessity. And so says, well, I don't really like the novel because it's so hard to read in one sitting. Okay, y'all. Hector had a great question. Poe, a generalist or specialist of his era? Yes. The answer is yes. It's a very professorial way to respond. But one of the things that we're now just figuring out is the extraordinary range of Poe's knowledge. And so when we think about whether he was able to work across so many different modes, whether that was a function of his deep, and I mean deep, need to get paid and have some money, or whether that's connected to just a sort of really expansive mind, a mind that was constantly in motion, constantly in flux. Poe read immense amounts of poetry, prose, criticism, science. I think I said last time we're really starting to understand the depth of his scientific knowledge. So he knew a lot about a lot of different things, but he often would start to get into obsessive periods where he would learn everything he could about mesmerism, or everything he could about cosmology, or about any number of other topics, and he would go from this generalist novelist to this like almost obsessive deep dive into something, and then often on his way back up have produced a really interesting story along the way. Let me take one more question, and then I think I want to bring us toward a more interactive discussion. Crystal said, I have a question about foreign languages in Poe. On Chickasaw, I noticed 2 or 3 references in Chickasaw languages as an exotic, unknowable language. Can you talk more about that? Absolutely. And I'll just say, this goes back, in fact, to Hector's question about generalist versus specialist. It does mean that along the way, there are moments where you're like, yeah, Poe doesn't really know what he's talking about. And that is one example where some of his references, he'll just sort of evoke something to, I think in some ways, as Crystal is suggesting here, it's exotic, it's unknowable. And that often comes along with stereotypical and often offensive or racist representations too. And there's a lot of that in Poe. And I will say, don't do the thing. I've read all of Poe. I've read a lot of Poe in a lot of different settings. I am keenly aware when those icky, wince-inducing moments are coming in Poe. But it is the case that you always want to read ahead, just to make sure in a Poe story that an occasional eruption of sort of problematic language or racist representation, that you have a context to be able to offer for it or something to say about it. It will often sort of show up in the most unexpected of places. I've certainly made that mistake early in my career, just kind of going with the story that I hadn't reread closely and then getting in class and saying, okay, well, I guess we're going to talk about this now. And so just be aware that some of that stuff is there. I will say that his knowledge of foreign languages in particular, he was much more of a polymath than a polyglot, which is to say he knew a little bit about a lot of things, a generalist, would dig into specific areas of knowledge, but linguistically, he was just not quite the same proficiency. That has a little to do with his education. He will sometimes mess up Latin quotations or Greek quotations. And some of that seems, as I suspect with the Chickasaw stuff, as a way to, signal broad knowledge, signal sort of his command of something that he didn't totally have command of, if that makes sense.
I was going to mention that I actually kind of thought that it was somewhat flattering the way that it was so hard to access, because the truth is that of the 5 Southeastern, they're the smallest, or we're the smallest, and there's only 34 speakers left. Wow. So yeah, so I thought that it was really interesting that he picked that particular one, the one that is hardest to access for those references.
Yeah, that's a really and not surprisingly, Poe is one of these massive major figures in not just American but in literature. And so of course that means that there's someone like me who is really trying to, there's a Poe industry. And when you notice something like that, I'm always happy to recommend places to go look. I'm always happy to help you look for if there's been any criticism about that stuff. But I'll just say, when you're talking about such a big writer, if you all individually come up with something and say, I want to know more about this, or I think nobody's talking about this, I'm always happy to, I'm obviously in touch with the editors of the big journals, and sometimes a little note produced by people who are actually teaching these stories can really be helpful to scholarship and to future teachers, to say like, here's just a little description of what's going on in this strange moment in Poe, and here's how we might think about it going forward. Again, it's a big ongoing scholarly conversation that started a long time before I was born, and will go on a long time after I'm gone. So I love that. I love thinking about that. Okay, let me just say to Kathleen had a wonderful comment about thinking differently, that the magazines in the 19th century are not the people magazines of the 21st. And that is absolutely right. I mean, a lot of these magazines, when I say send your students to the magazines, it might be a little boring at first for them. And they should not, there's not a 19th century version of who wore it better, Hawthorne or Poe. That is not a thing. But there is still a ton of really interesting stuff in the magazine culture, in the print culture of the day. And I think that's a really helpful, Kathleen's a great comment about, again, the difference, the alterity of the past. And I like that as an opportunity for students and an opportunity for teachers.